Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, I'm going to be talking about episode 5 of season 2 of AMC's Better Call Saul. Join me, won't you? So, per usual, we will be talking about a few of the positives from this week's episode, a few of the negatives, as well as what we're looking forward to in the coming weeks on Better Call Saul. Now, straight off the bat, just the artistic intention really did jump out at me this week on Better Call Saul. Just that first shot of Chuck, without batting an eyelid, changing that light bulb, instantly told us we were in the past. And it also made me really consider for the first time that we may actually see when Chuck develops his allergy to electricity, and also just the way the entire flashback sequence was lit and color corrected really did inform us that despite how quaint and idealistic Chuck and his wife Rebecca's relationship may seem to be, with their cute conversations about Carol Burnett, who we'll talk more about in a moment, those really weren't the colorful, longed-for good old days that one might assume them to be. And also what that opening flashback sequence did was play two moments that would later be rhymed with in this episode. And the first of them was just kind of Jimmy's humorously unrestrained, jealous comments about how amazing he thought Chuck's life was. In his eyes, his brother had hit the jackpot, both with his career as well as his personal life, marrying such an amazing woman. But what Jimmy seemed to be missing was his brother's life wasn't perfect. Not everything was fully satisfying, neither was his marriage some idealistic partnership. But again, to our hero, other people always had it better than him, and he was always the one being left alone in the cold. An attitude which is both ironic and tragic and directly responsible for what happened next, and also will lead into the second moment with which this episode will later on rhyme. And that being, to make up for the lack of happiness and unity in his own life, Jimmy kind of leaned into the things that he would always lean into to remedy such problems, those being his humor and his charm. And it worked. Whether viewed as completely innocent or slightly malicious, Jimmy did use his personality to connect with Rebecca, effectively uniting the pair of them against Chuck. Something that Chuck would not be forgetting anytime soon. And to really twist that knife in, we cut to he and his wife in bed later that night, which was framed in a rather similar way to Walt and Skylar in bed at the height of their dull, unfulfilling marriage, where Chuck vainly attempts to crack a lawyer joke of his own, which, of course, fell completely and painfully on its face. Now, before I jump into talking about the scenes that did rhyme with the aforementioned moments, I did actually want to talk about Carol Burnett the singer and Chuck McGill the pianist, and what they have to say about nearly all of the characters on this show. Because just before Jimmy's arrival, Chuck was about to tell his wife why Carol Burnett used to tug on her ear. That being, after getting a job on television, the singer called her grandmother to inform her of the good news, to which the elderly woman requested that Carol say hello to her on TV. And though Carol informed her that the studio would never allow such things, she did say that she would say hello to her grandmother by tugging on her ear. And so, because the straightforward, normal way of accomplishing something for someone she loved wasn't available to her, Carol chose the slightly more abnormal, roundabout way to accomplish that. And though the roundabout ways that Jimmy and Mike have taken in the past weeks are slightly more illegal than tugging their ear, how they've gone about loving and caring for those they love are exactly what I would describe as roundabout ways. As per Chuck the pianist, it would now seem this week that we were provided the answer as to who Rebecca Boyes was, and perhaps why it was so very important that Chuck so perfectly play her music back at the beginning of episode 2. Because every single time he failed to play the notes perfectly, he was reminded how he failed to hold his family together perfectly. And even more foundational, what that ear-tugging and that imperfect piano playing highlighted were the ways how every single character's isolation on this show really could at least be partially attributed to their failure to recognize how alone and isolated everyone else was around them. Jimmy stays at work far later than anyone else, still struggling with a copy machine that hasn't become any less complicated even as he's moved up in the world, while Chuck comes in far earlier than anyone else to deal with his psychosomatic allergy to electricity. And Jimmy fails to help his girlfriend with his ridiculous amoral solution to her problem with her boss, while Chuck fails to help his wife with his holier-than-thou moralistic answer to her problem with her colleague. Or Jimmy is trapped in a job being forced to sing someone else's tune, which the hilarious pixie ninja Aaron made sure of right down to the spacing and margins, while Chuck is trapped in his own house forced to play the same tune over and over. And it's those unrecognized similarities that made the moments that rhymed with Jimmy's envy of his brother, as well as he and Rebecca's uniting against Chuck, all the more tragic. And the first of those moments was Jimmy re-encountering Bill in the courthouse bathroom. In Bill's eyes, Jimmy had made it. He had the cushy office, he had the company car, he had the hot secretary, and the fancy apartment. In his eyes, Jimmy was free. But all that Jimmy could see in Bill was the freedom that he had lost. The freedom to be the kind of lawyer that he wanted to be, able to use all the finesse that his little heart could desire. And that final shot especially just illustrated how trapped he felt. And the second moment, which is just a little more overt, was just Chuck providing for Kim what Jimmy could not. And man, he did it in such a sneaky, horrible way. I mean, you cannot follow up a story about Jimmy essentially killing their father with, "My brother doesn't have a bad heart. He just can't help himself." And expect the listener to actually hear and believe those kinder sentiments. I mean, Chuck knew exactly the effect that his words would have on Kim, and exactly the kind of wedge that it would place between his brother and her. And speaking of Kim, she really was kind of the hero of this episode, similar to episode 2 of season 1, which also directly followed an intense confrontation with Tuco. The show once again slowed down and gave us this rather extended montage, this time of Kim working her tail off to get back in Howard's good graces. And I particularly love the opening moments of that sequence, just kind of the editing and how it showed how fractured Kim's life was and how desperate she was to put it back together. And in classic Better Call Saul fashion, after bringing Mesa Verde in on retainer, Kim is still sent back to doc review, and her work passed on to Francis. And I just loved the shot of her beneath the huge HHM flag, really illustrating how she's just being crushed by this massive law firm. And not only did that montage really remind us, the viewer, that the show really is in love with finding the poetry in monotony, it also drew some rather interesting parallels between Kim and Jimmy, and did kind of make me wonder and dread, will Kim eventually give in to doing things the amoral way? And will seeing and feeling responsible for the corruption of his upstanding friend be the final death blow to Jimmy McGill, which will then allow Saul Goodman to rise from the ashes? Also, I've got to wonder, will ultimately Kim and Chuck team up against Howard? Because there does seem to be some sort of unspoken friction between Chuck and his longtime partner. And right when I was starting to get just a little bit concerned that we weren't seeing enough Mike this episode or furthering his storyline anymore, we got that thrilling, albeit terrifying, scene between he and Tuco's uncle, Hector Salamanca. And like I mentioned on last week's review, this show just continues to handle cameos with expert skill, because you in no way needed to have seen Breaking Bad to understand that this man, he means business. And lines like, "I'm looking for the best possible outcome for everybody," really were terrifying threats. And if indeed Hector Salamanca could so easily discover that Mike was once a cop, he could undoubtedly also easily discover where Stacy and Kaylee are now residing. And for me, this episode, it's not a negative so much as a concern. I just really want the writers later on down the line to find a really cool way to have Mike and Jimmy's storylines, which are now quite distinct, intersect. I just think that would really tie this show together in a beautifully cohesive way. So fingers crossed on that one. Those are my thoughts on this week's episode. I would still love to know what you guys thought of the episode though, so comment below. Let me know. Did you love it? Did you hate it? What do you think of the idea of this show actually showing us how Hector Salamanca ended up in that wheelchair that we saw him in Breaking Bad? Comment below and let me know. Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you all to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.